this session will be recorded and available. The link of the recording will be circulated afterwards, and the recording will be saved and made available on the PPN website. I hope you've all been getting the resources and the copies of the previous talks, and I hope they've been useful for yourselves. Welcome everybody back tonight. Tonight's speaker is Aoife Hughes. Aoife is an ecologist with Woodrow. She hails from Kilkenny, but spent a lot of time up in Sligo, and is a real outdoor enthusiast, having spent years in the Scouts, both across Ireland and in expeditions abroad. Aoife has got a first in environmental science at the NUI Galway and a master's from University College Cork as well. So Aoife has started working with Woodrow a few months ago and has been working from home in lockdown in Ballastadair. So Aoife, welcome. You're welcome to raise your hand or ask questions in the chat and ask questions about any of the topics as we go through. We also have on hand tonight Philip Doddy. Philip was our speaker on the first night, the botanist from Woodrow. And if you get any very technical botanical questions, hopefully we can pull Philip into that as well, if you don't mind, Philip. Thank you. Aoife, I pass to you. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, and I hope you enjoy this evening's presentation and that you learn something useful for yourselves going forward. And I suppose the main thing that before we go into any of the habitats and wildlife that surround Sligo, what I'd love to do is I'd love to know what you would like to get out of this evening's presentation and kind of chat. So if you have any specific I don't know, topics that you'd like to cover in any more detail, we can, if you want to let us know now, we can cover them in a bit more detail as we go along. So is there any suggestions before we start? Radio silence.
Everybody's on mute.
That's okay. So we'll bop through, and if you have any questions, just put them into the chat as we go along, okay? So to give you a quick rundown of what we're going to be covering today, we're going to look briefly at some of the designated sites that are around Sligo, just so you can see what kind of protected areas are in your localities. Then we're going to have a quick look at the main types of habitats that you'll find around Sligo, and then some of the species that you're going to find in those habitats. And what I would really love is I'd love you to get involved and ask questions and feed into the conversation as we go along. And finally, the last thing we're going to look at briefly is we're going to look at some tools for you to identify and record the biodiversity that you find in those habitats, including the species that are there. So, first of all, biodiversity isn't just about habitats and species, it's also about our relationship with nature. So Sligo has a long history of that, whether it's the waters and the wilds of W.B. Yeats or it's inspiring naturalists like Robert Prager, who talked about the unsurpassing beauty of Sligo and the high botanical interest that you find there. So, you know, there's so much to see, whether you're coming to look at it from a very scientific perspective, or if you're just there to, you know, enjoy the natural surroundings that Sligo is so famous for. So, one of the ways that those sites are protected is designated areas, but what does designated areas actually mean? So there's Natura 2000 sites, which are European designated sites, which are SPAs and SACs, and that basically just means that they're special protected areas, which cover bird protection, and then special areas of conservation, which cover habitats and other species apart from birds. So that's the basics of the Natura 2000 sites. And the idea of those designations is to try and create a network of really important habitats and species in Europe to keep the ecological integrity of the whole of Europe, but also in Ireland itself, so that we can keep nature resilient across the country. And then at a more national level, we've also got national heritage areas, which are our NHAs. And they tend to be protected at a planning and policy level, so that you basically keep those areas from being developed and being damaged by damaged by developments. And they tend to be, you can have national heritage areas that are for a variety of different species and habitats. So in terms of protected species, there is a huge variety of species in Ireland, some of which are protected under law just by themselves and others that are protected within designated sites. So there's 76 plant species that are protected under floral protection orders, which means that they're protected from being picked or uprooted or damaged. And then there's also the Wildlife Acts, which they protect against injury and disturbance and damage to breeding and resting sites for 32 different mammals, amphibians and reptiles, 3 invertebrate species, and all birds. And that also includes, you know, protection from hedge cutting and things like that. So I wanna make sure people are paying attention. So does anybody know any botanists out there, apart from Philip, he's exempt. Does anybody know what the species that's in this photograph is?
Okay, I can tell you one thing. It's not an insect.
An orchid.
An orchid.
It is.
Well done, Ciara, and whoever said that.
Orchid. May.
Well done.
May.
Yeah, thank you.
So this species is called the bee orchid, which, you know, the reason it's called the bee orchid is because it mimics bees, and it basically attracts bees to it to pollinate it. And this species grows on dry sandy soils, dunes, and in limestone pastures. And so if you're walking around in any of those habitats between June and July, keep your eyes out and you might see it down there. So well worth keeping an eye out. So that's one of the myriad of species that we have in Sligo to look out for. So in terms of other designated sites in Sligo, there's a total of about 58,500 hectares of protected area in Sligo. And that covers of SAC protected areas in Sligo, which covers over 5% of the total area of designated sites in the whole of Ireland. And that just emphasizes the importance of Sligo as a hub for biodiversity, and the importance of protecting the sites that we have here in order to ensure that the whole of Ireland can benefit from the biodiversity that we are protecting in this county. And one of the species that's protected is the only insect that's protected in the Habitats Directive in Ireland, which is the butterfly that we have there. Does anybody know what that species is?
Red Admiral, no?
Not quite.
Not Red Admiral, no.
Now, this species sometimes...
Tiger knot. No, it's not a knot, is it?
So this species, it lives, it's very specific in terms of the food plant that it lives on. And the food plant is the one in the top of this picture, which is the devil's bit scabious. And this plant...
Scabious. Scabious.
So does anybody have a suggestion of what they... Does anybody have any more ideas of what they think it is?
Devil, something devil.
So the species of butterfly that we have there is the marsh fritillary. And this is one of the... This is one of the only protected invertebrate species in Ireland. And it specifically lives on devil's bit scabious as its food plant for its caterpillars, which is why when we're looking at biodiversity, we need to look not just at the species, but also the habitats they live in. Because if there's no devil's bit scabious, there's no marsh fritillary. So that's why it's important to look at the big picture as well as the very small. Whoops, going backwards instead of forwards. And so we've talked about some of the designated sites in Ireland, in Sligo, but where exactly are they? So in total, there's 10 sites that are designated at a European level for birds, which are the SPAs. There's 20 sites which are designated for other habitats and species, which are our SACs. And then there's 3 NHAs and 34 proposed NHAs. And NHAs and PNHAs are designated for a variety of different habitats or species. So as you can see, when you're in Sligo, you're never very far away from a designated site, considering about 20% of the county is actually designated. So, you know, there's so much biodiversity that's being protected around you. So it's worth having a look and seeing, you know, what's the designated sites in your locality and what are they designated for? So then you can keep an eagle eye out and see, am I going to find some marsh fritillary? Am I going to find some bee orchids? You never know. So we're going to start our tour of the habitats of Sligo in the upland areas, just so we can have a good view of where we're going. So in terms of habitats that you find in the uplands of Sligo, you're going to find things like alpine and boreal plants. You're going to find heaths, you're going to find blanket bogs, raised bogs, springs, and cliffs. So we're going to go through some of these in a bit more detail, but we're going to start with a case study, a pretty famous case study that I think most people here should be familiar with. Ben Bulben. I don't think anybody was going to guess that one wrong, so I didn't bother asking. So Ben Bulben is one of the best sites in the country, as well as, you know, the county as well, for looking for alpine plants. So alpine plants are ones that you generally find at high elevation. So they're well above a tree line. Not that there's that many trees on Ben Bulben, but it's one of the best sites in Ireland in terms of the amount of species that are there, in terms of numbers, but also the amount of species that are there in terms of diversity. So this is something that's just on your doorstep and well worth having a look at. And some of the species that are found on Ben Bulben aren't found anywhere else in Ireland, including things like the fringe sandwort and the alpine saxifrage. And the cliff areas, which are also an important upland habitat, can be nesting spots for different species of birds, such as choughs, which are a relative of the crow, and they have a red beak, a red bill and red feet, and they're really acrobatic flyers, like they're gorgeous to watch in the sky. You can also have different different birds of prey that also can nest in cliffs. And we're going to have a look at some of them later on. So when you're up in the uplands of Sligo, what you generally find is there's a pretty dominant habitat, and that is blanket bog. And this blanket bog, it forms in areas of high rainfall in upland areas because of our wet Atlantic climate. Lots of rain creates lots of peat in upland areas. And then the species that you generally find in blanket bogs tend to be species like heather, cotton grass, which is also called bog cotton, if anybody knows it by that name, and then bog mosses, which are your things like sphagnum, which is the bog builder. So that's the species that tends to dominate bogs. And these blanket bogs are really important for bird species like the Greenland white-fronted geese, and then for breeding golden plover, merlin, and other ground nesting birds you might find in that habitat as well are things like skylark and meadow pipit. So while they might not look all that extraordinary, not very extreme looking habitats, but they are really rich in diversity. So they're well worth having a look at. So can anyone tell me, does any bird watchers out there, do you know what the bird in the top of the screen is?
What size is it?
It's pretty small, like it's not, maybe like thrush sized. Like it's not huge.
Is he a dipper?
No, so this is an
No.
upland species.
Okay.
These are more kind of water courses, you'd find them there. But good guess though. I will give you a hint. It's mentioned in the text. You just got to figure out which of the birds it is in the text.
Golden plover.
Yes, you get extra points of I don't know you get I don't know. We don't have anything to give apart from the prize of boasting. You get to boast. But yeah, that's golden plover, which is a species that it's a summer visitor that comes in from France and Iberia, and it's a winter visitor from Iceland. So it's kind of coming from both directions, but a really gorgeous bird. And it feeds on invertebrates and plant matter, such as berries and seeds and grasses. So it's a bit like us. It's kind of eating a bit of anything that comes around. So while we're in the quiz mood, can we have any guesses for what these species are? Pretty common in bogs, especially blanket bogs. So does anybody have a guess of what they are? Any suggestions?
Is that a buzzard to the bird? Is he a buzzard?
It's a very good guess, because you can also find buzzards flying around the place. But this one, I'll give you a hint about what it is. It's the fastest bird in Ireland.
Tula says hen harrier.
Nope.
Peregrine falcon.
Yes, excellent. Well done. I was saying, ding, 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 ding.
And Margaret has asked, is the top one heather? Is it a close-up of heather?
Yes, it is heather. So
Well done, Margaret.
that species is really common in bogs, in heaths, especially drier areas. You'll find heather there. So the last species on that slide is probably the trickiest, and it's the one that's probably hardest to see if you're out on a bog. Does anybody have any ideas? I'll tell you.
Is it carnivore?
It is. This species eats insects, which you might not think that Irish species are going around nomming on insects, but this one does. So this one, I'll tell you, because it's not one you might come across very easily. This is a sundew. So, boop. Right. So the species that are here, heather, it grows really abundantly in the acid soils of uplands and heaths. Sundew, which is this plant here, is one of our native carnivorous plants, of which we've got a couple of different species. This one, these little sticky tendrils, insects land on them, and then the plant goes and curls in on top of them, and then it releases digestive enzymes and basically breaks down the plant, or breaks down the animal. So they've adapted this strategy because they live in really nutrient poor environments. So they need that extra source of nutrients, which is really interesting. But I'm glad I'm not an insect. And along with choughs, peregrines also nest pretty frequently along cliff faces because they like somewhere they can dive off. So they're really they can reach huge speeds when they're diving, which is, I think they're the fastest bird in the world. So it's cool to have them in Ireland. So we're going to leave the upland areas and we're going to get away from them by going downstream. So in terms of watercourses in Ireland, or watercourses in Sligo, Sligo is with the catchments that are draining from Sligo are the Ballysadare, the Moy, and the Garabog rivers. So they're the rivers that drain Sligo. And they can support really interesting biodiversity, some of which is like really specialized for rivers and some of which lives kind of incidentally along them. And one of the species that's super interesting and really important is the freshwater pearl mussel. And I'm not sure if you know about the freshwater pearl mussel or not, but it is one of the longest lived species in Ireland. You know, there's freshwater pearl mussels that can live up to 140 years, but they need really clean water. So they need not sediment in it, they need gravel beds that are really oxygen rich in order for them to live there, and they'll filter the water and clean it, which is really important for water quality. But we're really lucky in Sligo that we actually do have a healthy population of freshwater pearl mussel in the Easky River. So it's great to have them, especially because Ireland has one of the biggest global populations of freshwater pearl mussel, and that population is in danger because of the decline in water quality, both in Europe and in Ireland over the last 50 or so years. So it's really important that we protect the water quality of not just the rivers that the freshwater pearl mussel are in, but also the other rivers, so that they're not feeding into the freshwater pearl mussel rivers and causing more of an issue. Likewise, the River Moy and its tributaries are designated for salmonids, which include things like sea trout and obviously your salmon. So it's really important that those rivers are kept at a high quality in order for the salmon to be able to go to those rivers and lay their eggs, and so that we have more salmon coming back year on year. Another species that lives in Sligo in Lough Gill is the freshwater, or no, not freshwater, the white cloud crayfish. And Ireland is really lucky that it has a big population of white cloud crayfish, whereas in Europe there has been declines in this species, especially because there's introduced species such as ones from Australia, which can outcompete the white cloud crayfish in Europe. So another really important species that Ireland has a relatively healthy population of, but has a big responsibility for keeping that population healthy. So once we get past our rivers, we're going to rest by our lakes. So there's a few different types of lakes and wetlands that we have in Ireland. So you have your thurlocks, you have your hardwater lakes like Lough Arrow, and you have your raised bogs, like, you know, you have a lot of them in the Midlands, but raised bogs are quite similar to, raised bogs are quite similar to blanket bogs, but they generally tend to form in depressions where there's not much, where the drainage is impeded. So what you find is the bog will build up basically out of the sphagnum, and you can end up with a dome shape rather than it being on a hill. So the peat is shallower in blanket bogs and deeper in raised bogs. So you can have very deep levels of peat in blanket bogs or in raised bogs. And there is some active raised bogs in Sligo in various different areas as well. So yeah, then we're going to have a quick chat about thurlocks, because Ireland's pretty lucky that we have quite a few of these really special habitats. So thurlocks are basically vanishing lakes that you find in depressions in limestone areas. So where there's a hollow, and in the winter, the water level rises, so the water table is above the level of the soil. So you end up with basically a temporary lake. And these areas can have really specific and really interesting species that are adapted to that kind of up and down water level. And this habitat is internationally important because Ireland has basically all of it. There's very few thurlocks outside of Ireland, and very few even in Northern Ireland. And Sligo is really lucky that it actually does have some thurlocks, whereas most of the thurlocks are found in the counties of Clare, Galway and Roscommon. Sligo does have a few to boast to its own name. Lakes, you know, if your thurlock is dried out in the summer, you go visit your lakes. So
Aoife, when
yes.
you're talking about visiting lakes, I've just put up in the chat all the lakes that have special walks around as well. I think there's about 8 different walks around the county, from Dooney Rock to Loch Talt, Bunduff, Hazelwood and Loch Easkey as well.
Oh, Loch Easkey. Yeah, you can have a look in the water and see, do you see any freshwater pearl mussel as you're wandering along the side of the river? So yeah, lakes, like rivers, they're all very changeable and they depend on the conditions around them. So they can vary depending on the type of bedrock that they have and the quality of the water that goes into them. So if you've got high quality water going in, like clean water, much better for the lake and the biodiversity that's in it. There's some lakes in Sligo that are naturally rich in nutrients, so like Lough Gill, and there are others that are kind of, you know, moderate levels of nutrients, not too much, not too little, and they are generally, some of them are spring fed from limestone beds, so where the water is upwelling from underneath the lake and filling it. So Lough Arrow is an example of that. And then there's others that are like bog pools and things where they're acidic and they're nutrient poor, but they are their own type of lake. And the first two types of lake, your naturally nutrient rich like Lough Gill and your medium nutrient spring fed lakes like Lough Arrow, those are both internationally important at a European level. So it's really good to have those examples right on our doorstep that we can go and we can admire and we can enjoy and kind of brag about our lovely lakes. So now that we've had a look at some of the wetlands that we have in Sligo, what kind of value do they give us? So first off, you've got your biodiversity value. You know, these are rich habitats. They're really good for species diversity, for really unique habitats as well. So whether you're looking at your turlocks or your lakes, your wetlands or your raised bogs, you know, these habitats are, some of them are unique to Ireland, some of them are the species that are in them are unique to Sligo. So it's really important that when we look at biodiversity, we look at how unique and how wonderful it is that we have these spaces right on our doorstep. So then there's also the amenity value of these lakes and these wetlands. You know, they're just like Sharon said, there are walkways around these lakes where you can go and you can enjoy the value of nature that's there. But also some of these lakes, they're offering flood protection, whether it's a bog that's soaking up rainwater so that it doesn't flow down the river in big pulses and flood the downstream areas, or whether it's a floodplain where the water spreads out, slows down, drops the sediment, and then it doesn't have that big force coming through a town or a village. So, you know, beyond just a biodiversity value, these wetlands and lakes have an economic value, you know, for the economic disaster that they help us avoid. And it's just one of the ways that nature is paying us back, even if we're not actually realizing it. And just as these lakes and wetlands slow down the water, they can also help filter it, filtering out sediments and improving the water quality, which makes, if some of that water is then going into water treatment plants, it means that there is not as much treatment that needs to go into it in order to keep it up to the correct standard. So it's another benefit of having these wetlands in your area. So it's a bit hot by the wetlands. We decided we're going to go for a walk in the woodland. And there's two quite distinct and quite interesting types of habitat that you can find in Sligo that are really just beautiful. So you've got your upland oak woodland, such as the ones that are found around Lough Gill, and these are important because they support a variety of species, some of which are really unusual and really localized in terms of where they occur. So things like the strawberry tree, ivy broomrape, purple hair-streaked butterfly. Then when you go from your uplands and you get down to your lake shores, if you're coming from your lake to your uplands, you might come across some wet woodlands. And these are generally, you find them around lake shores, and they're kind of like an in-between habitat. So you're going from your fens, which is your kind of wetland area, to your drier woodlands like your oak woodland. And in between, you've got this wet woodland, and it's generally got things like alder and willow, and it's generally very rich in invertebrates. So you'll have your things like dragonflies and your damselflies, and you'll also have all the things that come into that woodland looking to have a snack on your invertebrates. So just some examples of the woodlands that you have in Sligo. So these are just 4 examples. So if you're going for a walk at a weekend, maybe have a look at some of these and see what you find there. So you've got your Slishwood, Unionwood, Lough Gill Forest and Benbulben Forest Park. And if you're already going as far as Benbulben Forest, you might want to wander up and see, do you find any alpines on the way? Or keep your eyes on the sky and see, do you find any peregrines or choughs? So before we go on, I'd like to just do a little quiz, see who's savvy of their woodland plants. Does anybody know what the 2 species in the top of the top picture are? These are pretty common woodland plants.
Yeah, that's the bluebell and the primrose.
Yes, excellent.
Okay,
So
what?
these species, they generally, you'll find them, they come out in early spring, and they're kind of adapted to the Irish woodland habitat, where if you've got an oak woodland, even if you go to Union Wood at the minute, you'll see that the canopy isn't open yet. It's kind of later to come out. So these plants, they come out early in the spring and they get the light before the canopy of the trees closes up. So they're kind of like, get there first, get there fast, then leave just before just before they become unwelcome. And the woodland, the bluebell that we have here, this is an Irish bluebell. So it's worth knowing the difference between the Irish and the Spanish bluebell. So the Irish bluebell has this kind of nodding habit, and you'll see that all of the flowers are all along one side of the stem. Whereas if you see the Spanish bluebell, they're very upright, and you'll find the flowers are on both sides of the stem, not just one, and they don't have that nodding habit. They also, if you look at them, the flowers are slightly lighter blue, and if you look inside them, the pollen on the Spanish bluebell is blue, whereas the Irish bluebell, the pollen is white. So it's worth having a look and kind of sussing out, being like, where are you from? Even if it's just a quiz that you want to challenge yourself or challenge your neighbor, be like, we're going on a walk and we're going to see what kind of bluebells do we find. And then the second thing we're going to have a look at is just this plant here. I don't know, does anybody know what this plant is? Do we have any takers?
Strawberry tree.
Yes, excellent, well done. So
What was that?
Strawberry tree. With no strawberry.
excellent. Well done, because this plant is really rare. You know, it's only found in the counties of Sligo, Cork, and Kerry. So it's really great that we have it here in Sligo to have a look at. Although I'm pretty sure you can't eat the berries. Don't try. I'm pretty sure they're not edible, and I don't recommend it. But yeah, that's a strawberry tree, and it's funny. It's not. You might not think it, but it's actually from the heather family rather than from being, you know, related to any of the other ones.
Mhm.
And you can find it around the area of Lochgill. So it's one of those like really unique plants that you'll find in Sligo and very little places else. So if you're going for a walk around Lochgill, having a look at the wildlife, have a look up and see, do you find any strawberry trees as well? So when you're looking up at the trees,
Mhm.
have a look and see, do you find any of these guys as well? So there's a variety of different animals that live in our woodlands, some of which are a lot shyer than others. So you might not see them, but you might see tracks of them. Excuse me. So species that you'll find in Irish woodlands are things like pine marten, red squirrel, badgers, foxes, bats, and fallow deer. You'll find birds there like willow warblers, chiff-chaffs, jays, ravens, gullcrows, tree creepers, kestrels, sparrowhawks, and buzzards. So one of the things, if you're looking for a tree creeper, if you see what looks like a mouse going up the tree, you know, it's not a mouse, it's probably a tree creeper, but they have that kind of like scuttly look as they climb up the tree. So definitely worth keeping an eye out because they're very cool little birds. And you don't have to look just in a woodland, you might find them just in a tree in a park as well. So really cool plant, or really cool bird. And then jays, if you happen to be going for a walk in Union Wood, there's definitely jays there. But they are quite a secretive little bird. Well, not little, they're pretty big. They're quite a secretive bird though. So keep your ears out because you're more likely to hear them than you are to see them. And they have quite a harsh call because they're actually in the same family as crows. So you'll hear this kind of rattly call. And jays are actually, they're big gatherers of acorns, which they tend to cache in different places. And some of them they forget about. And then you end up with new oak trees growing. So, you know, I always like them as little like impromptu gardeners around the place. So when I see them, I'm always delighted. And yeah, all of these different species, they're also in, there's also a lot of invertebrate species that live in woodlands. So you'll have your butterflies, your damselflies, especially if you're near a wetland or a stream. And you'll also have just loads of different species that are going to come in and out of woodlands as just really rich habitats. So some of those species are things like these two here. One of these is quite tricky. The other one is pretty common. So do we have any takers for either?
Foxglove?
Yes, excellent. Any takers for our butterfly?
No.
Any ideas?
No.
That's okay. This species is quite rare. You will find it near in and around Lochgill. I think there's some populations of it. This species is the purple hair streak, and this is one of the
Right.
yeah. And what's actually really interesting about this species is it's actually sitting on its food plant there. Can anyone figure out what kind of species it's or what plant it's sitting on? It's kind of hard to see from there.
Like oak.
Oak tree?
Oak.
Yes, it's oak. So this species, the purple hair streak, their food plant for their caterpillars is oak. And that's just another one of those examples of the fact that when you're looking at a species, you got to look at, where does it live and what does it eat as well as anything else. So purple hair streak, they feed on oak. So if you're looking for purple hair streak, no point in looking where there's no oak. You gotta look at what a species needs in order to try and track it down. So when you're sussing out all your habitats and your wildlife after you leave here, keep an eye on what do things eat and where do they like to live, because that's the best way of tracking down where they are. So as we're going and leaving our woodlands, it might be getting a bit dark and we're kind of wandering out, and there's another species that we're likely to find if we're wandering around at dusk, and that species is bats.
That's.
Exactly.
That's.
Yeah. So for one thing, I think they're just amazing, but there's 9 species of bats that have been confirmed in Ireland, and all of them are protected under Irish law and the EU Habitats Directive as well. They're all nocturnal and they're all active during the summer, and they hibernate in the winter. So they're starting to be active now. So if you're walking around at dusk, maybe, at the edge of a woodland, you may see bats flying around. So keep an eye on the sky just in case. And while bats aren't blind, they do navigate largely with echolocation. And that is just so that they can see where they're going and locate all of their prey as they're wandering around the place. And another thing that's really important for bats is linear features and habitat features. So they need areas like wetlands where they're going to find invertebrates, but they also need linear features to get them from one place to another. So that's why it's really important that we have things like hedgerows in our landscape, because they're where bats will fly along. They don't like to go across open fields. They want to have something that they can, it's like their little highway that they'll fly along to go via linear features. So it's worth thinking about that when you're thinking about creating habitats in your area. Think about how you can connect one habitat to another, because you never know, it might become a species highway. So when we're talking about that kind of leads us nicely on to human influence habitats. And there are so many of these, but we're just going to talk about a few just briefly. So we have our gardens, our parks, our graveyards, our railway lines, our walkways, hedgerows and shrubs, just like we were just saying, and bare earth banks. So the 2 pictures here, both of them are human influence habitats. One of them is a bare earth bank, and the other is an area of unmown lawn that was just left go a little bit longer in, the whole no mow May, let's let some wildflowers grow. So we've got some dandelions here. Excuse me, hiccups are going crazy. So the top species that we have here, this is the ashy mining bee. So this species burrows into sandy banks, and it's a type of solitary bee, of which we have about 99 species in Ireland. So not all bumblebee, no, there's 99, yeah. Is it 68 species of bumblebee? I don't know. There's around 60, I think, species, 60 plus species of solitary bee, of which the ashy mining bee is one. And this species, it burrows into sandy banks. So if you're creating an area and you have a bank of soil, maybe think of, instead of planting the whole thing, if it's a sunny south-facing site, you could leave an area bare, and then you can have, that area is perfect for solitary bees that come and they burrow into the sandy bank. So it's a really simple way of creating habitats in a built-up area for bees, so that they don't have to fly as far. Because some of these, their foraging ranges are quite small. As you can see, like the species, the plants, or the bees themselves are tiny. Like this is one of the little solitary bees here as well. And this is on a dandelion, which just gives you a sense of scale. So yeah, in terms of human habitats, another really important one, and also a really dominant one, is our agricultural areas. So we're going to do a little quiz here. Please put your voice in. If you know any of these, just put your voice up, and I'd love to hear what people know about them. So the one here on the left, does anybody know what that is?
Cowslip.
Excellent.
Cowslip.
We've got a bunch of botanists here. And the second one there?
Elderberry? No. Blueberry. It's like blueberry. No, it's not.
Gin.
It's,
Gin.
Slow.
Slows.
Slow bush.
Eh,
Strawberries.
No. I'm not sure who's thinking of gin, but it's tempting. Yes, so this is sloes, and they do look a bit like blueberries. They do look a bit like grapes. But these, if you go around right at the moment, the blackthorn bush, which is what grows with, which is the plant that sloes grow on as the fruit, they're currently just coming out of flower. So if you go around, you'll see hedgerows that are full of white. That's blackthorn in bloom. Whereas hawthorn, here's a trick for you. Hawthorn, the leaves come out first, and then the flowers come out in about May. Yeah. Whereas the blackthorn, the flowers come first, and then the leaves come after. So
Sneaky.
that's a really
Very
good way of
sneaky.
figuring it out.
Very sneaky.
Yeah. It's the best way of figuring out botany.
Blackthorn flowers first.
Yep, flowers first, and the leaves come after the flowers. Hawthorn, I'm almost getting it.
Leaves come first.
Leaves
And
come
flowers
first.
come second.
Next. Excellent. We'll have people go.
Yeah.
So I think we can figure out what's this third one here. Anybody?
Coyote.
Ox.
Fox. Excellent. Excellent. So this is our little Madrorua. This fox was actually on my farm at home, which is why the picture is slightly grainy. I was just so excited. I couldn't keep still. But yeah, you're going to find foxes, you'll find urban foxes, you'll also find them in farmed habitat. But that's why it's really important that when we put in farms, and not when we put in farms, but when we're managing farmland and we're managing our habitats in our community, that we make space for nature, whether it's, in this case, there's a pond, which tends to draw in things like moorhens, and then that tends to draw in things like foxes. So whatever kind of habitats you have in your location, it's worth thinking, how can I draw these together? How can I just change slightly what I'm doing? And sometimes changing slightly what I'm doing is literally just stepping back and letting nature do its own thing. And you never know, you just never know what's going to turn up. Someday you might just be, standing there and then a fox trots out in front of you. So well worth a bit of just laid back management. And then these last two are a little bit tricky, but we'll see. I feel like we've got a good group here that are great at their botany. So anybody got a suggestion for the second last one there?
Mountain ash.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Yes, it's the rowan, the mountain ash.
Or elder.
Yeah, mountain ash it was, but the flowers do look a little bit like elder.
Ash, yeah.
But yeah, mountain ash, lovely plant. It's one of my favorites, and it's beloved of birds, which is why we never see any elderberries at our house. They're always gone. Or not elderberries, sorry, I'm getting them confused now. We never see any rowan berries. The elderberries are also gone, but the rowan berries are always gone because the birds love them.
Yeah.
They're a great source of nutrients for birds, and they're also great for pollinators because obviously you've got all these flowers early in the season and then your berries afterwards. So, you know, another plant for your little wildflower patches. And then finally, our last one here. Anybody got any guesses? We're doing really well.
Orchid?
Orchid, yes.
What type of orchid? Yeah.
I don't know which orchid though.
Sorry, I think I
It's
missed.
an orchid?
It is an orchid. It's a specific type of orchid.
Gonna hard to see.
Oh, sorry. The picture is probably a little bit blurry.
Is it a spotted orchid? No.
Not quite, no. So this species is a pyramidal orchid.
Oh, pyramid, okay.
You can see it's kind of pyramidal shaped. And this species, you can find it in a lot of different areas. This one, it's in a grassy habitat that just hasn't been mown. So this is actually just an area of amenity grassland that was just management kind of stepped back and went, we're just going to see what's there before we keep mowing it. And there was orchids, there was things like self-heal, there was, you know, violets, lots of different things. Even the cowslip is from the same location. So sometimes stepping back and just taking a chill approach, you'll find that there's so much biodiversity underneath your feet that maybe just didn't have a chance to, grow up and show its colors. So yeah, excellent. Guys, we've got a really good group of botanists here. Maybe we'll start recruiting. So now that we've kind of gone away from our gardens and we've come down from the mountains, we went by our rivers, we went through our woodlands, we went through our gardens, and now we're going to go down to the coast and take a sunny trip to the seaside. So the kind of habitats that you'll find along coasts are generally things like your dunes, your salt marshes, your mud and sand flats, your estuaries, mocker, and rock pools. So there's other habitats there as well, but these are some of the main ones, and they're really interesting habitats, each and every one. So the first one we're going to have a look at is the sand dunes. And one of the species we're going to find on our sand dunes, as we've said, sandy habitats, is our bee orchid. So, there's a specific, so where you have stable or fixed dunes, that's a really particularly rare habitat, and that's generally one that has like some vegetation to stop it moving around the place. So this habitat generally includes species like wild thyme, thyme broomrape, wild carrot, and orchids like the bee orchid and the pyramidal orchid. And as we saw, pyramidal orchid also grows in grassland areas like on the previous page. So lots of different species, so many amazing different types of diversity that you can find along sand dunes. So as we move away from our sand dunes, the next thing we're going to find is there's generally a grassy area that kind of forms sometimes behind sand dunes. And these areas, there's areas there called mocker. A mocker is generally, it describes an area of a grassy area that's formed from wind-blown calcareous soil, basically, which means that calcareous is just that it's chalky soil. I don't know if I'm describing it exactly right, but it's a specific type of habitat that is really it's quite unique and restricted, and it's also quite an important habitat at an EU level, and it does exist in Sligo, which is something to be proud of. And they generally are quite species rich and have a mix of wet and dry habitats, being, you know, quite close to the water level. And one of the species that is unique to the west of Ireland that can be found in these kind of habitats is called the fringed rock cress, which is found near Ross's Point. And generally, mocker habitats are found in association with fixed dunes and also with coastal lagoons. And coastal lagoons can have some really interesting and important species like your rare slender-leaved pondweed. And these coastal lagoons can vary from being like very saline and quite salty to being almost freshwater. So there's a huge variety in terms of what a coastal lagoon can be like, and as a result, there's a huge variety in terms of the kind of species that will live in those lagoons. So we're going to move away from our grassy areas, and we're going to go down and have a look at, whoops, I always go the wrong way. We're going to have a look at our estuaries. So estuaries, there's mud and sand flats of the Sligo estuaries are really important for thousands of wintering and passage wading birds. And that includes species like the pale-bellied Brent goose. And that species is a winter migrant from the high Arctic in Canada. And it generally occurs in Ireland between October and April. So this species, the Brent goose, it winters almost entirely in Ireland, which makes its presence here really important, and it means that we have to do our best to protect the habitats that it lives in when it's here, and to ensure that when the species is here, that we do our best not to disturb it either. So, when you see these species in your area, it's really important that, keep your distance and try and do your best to minimize the amount of disturbance to these species, because I know if I had to fly all the way from Canada, I wouldn't like to be chased by a dog when I'm here. So just, it's something to bear in mind in any habitat is, we really want to see biodiversity, but make sure that when we do so, we keep a respectful distance so that, when we see biodiversity doesn't run the other direction. But yeah, other species that live or feed along estuaries include species like common seals and otters. So sometimes you'll see a picture of an otter munching away on a crab. And I wish I had that much energy to go catch my own dinner. So yeah, then other species that you're going to find in kind of coastal habitats are things like seaweeds. There's a variety of species of seaweeds that live in Ireland, and where you'll find them depends on their tolerance to different conditions, because the seashore is a really tough place to live. You're getting battered around the place. Sometimes you're stuck out in the sunshine all day, and then until the tide comes in, sometimes you're just your conditions vary all over the place. So the gradient of species on the seashore will change. So some species are really tolerant of stress, and they'll live high on the seashore. And then other species that are less tolerant will live lower down, where they don't get as much disturbance. And then you'll have the species like kelps, which live right underneath the water, so they're always submerged, except if there's something like a really low tide. So this is just an example of a seashore with some seaweeds on it, but there's also this picture here. I don't know, does anybody know what this type of algae is called?
It's laminaria, the big piece.
Well, this species is called Saccharisa polysaccharides, and the English name is furbelows. But I think it's most commonly known by this thing here, which is known as a sea hedgehog. And this section, the sea hedgehog, is what's called a holdfast. So algae aren't like plants. They don't have roots. What they have instead is they have a holdfast, which just anchors them onto a stony sediment. So they're not drawing any nutrients through the holdfast. It's just to hold them on. So that's how algae or seaweeds, they're not the same as plants at all. Totally different type of life strategy, but really interesting. And I hear they're quite a snack, although I would really recommend looking into how to forage for seaweeds extensively to know what to do. I'm certainly not an expert, but amazing sites down by the sea. And some of those sites are the species you see. So you might be really lucky and you'll see some species out in the water, so things like your dolphins, or you might see nesting birds. So you've got your species that might be kind of drift around the sea for most of the year and then come to land just to nest. So, even there's spaces where you'll see things like gannets that nest in colonies, are really famous example of that is down in Skelligs, where you've got big colonies of things like gannets and puffins. But you'll also have your species like your brent goose, which are going to be more in your estuary areas. So what's really interesting and really important about our sea areas is that they're really dynamic. You know, there's species coming, there's species going, and there's species that live there all the time. So it's really like a really vibrant city. You know, there's people moving all over the place, but they're all filling in different gaps in terms of the ecosystem and how it functions. So yeah, I'm just going to quickly go through. I just want to pick out 2 areas that maybe might interest people, just give them some idea of some specific protected areas that are in your locality. So in the Mullaghmore area, which is gorgeous and has a lot of really interesting coastal habitat. Some of the protected habitats that you'll find there are things like your mockers, which we discussed earlier, your semi-natural dry grasslands. So those can have some really interesting species on them as well. Juniper scrub, which, if anybody knows, we're already on the topic of gin earlier, but juniper is also used to flavor gins. So, I mean, if you want to start a gin factory in Sligo, you know, you've got a few things going for you. You got your sloes, you got your juniper, you're sorted. And you've also got things like alkaline fens. So alkaline fens are where the water is, alkaline, which just means that the pH is slightly basic, which is that the pH is above 7 in technical terms. But there's also some like specifically protected species. So we've talked about protected habitats, which are, you know, your mocker, your fens, your scrub, but you've also got, like, remember we talked about protected species, where if you zoom in close, you've got things like the petalwort, this specific petalwort, which is protected at it just for its own sake, not as part of a bigger habitat. So your petalwort, you'll find it in mocker sites, whereas some of our other species here, like this is wild thyme, which, you know, smells amazing. But that's found in dry mocker sites. And then you've got things like your bog pimpernel, which is a fen species. So when you're in those kind of more wet areas, you might see this. And then you've got your marram grass, which is, you know, a really diagnostic dune species. So, you know, there's so much that these different species are telling you about their habitats. Their habitats are telling you about what kind of species you might find there. So just did a quick one on Mullaghmore, but what we're going to do, oops, I always go the wrong direction. I'm going to skip Enniscrone, I'm sorry. But what I'm
Michael's here.
Okay, we'll go really quickly through it and just say that there's a couple
We've got quite a few questions coming through as well. We can have them at the end in the discussion, Aoife. So
Okay.
about 10-15 minutes left.
All right, well, I want to highlight just a few things first. So we'll just fly through Enniscrone. I'm sorry, Enniscrone people. But types of protected habitats that you'll find around Enniscrone are things like there's Atlantic salt meadows, there's mud flats and sand flats, which we've already discussed. So you're going to be experts when you go out there. Your fixed dunes, we've already dealt with some of those. And then your protected species. So we've already talked about golden plover, so that's great. But you've got another really interesting and really unique species, which is the curlew. And the curlew is quite an iconic species, and there's a lot of efforts being taken in Ireland to try and protect the curlew because it is in serious trouble in Ireland. So there's some that come into Ireland as a winter visitor, and then there's some that breed in Ireland year long, but the breeding species has been in serious decline in the last couple of decades. So there's some like really strong efforts being taken in order to try and halt that decline and bring them back up, because it was at one stage a very common species in Ireland. So threats to biodiversity in Ireland, or not in Ireland, but in Sligo. Does anybody have any suggestions of what kind of threats do you think there are to biodiversity in Sligo?
Farming?
Farming, not all farming, certain types of farming. So there's certain types of farming that I'm not going to tar all farmers with the same brush. There's some farmers that do make extraordinary efforts for farming, or not for farming, for biodiversity. and they do a great deal to manage their habitats in a way that really works to benefit the species that live there. But there is certain agricultural practices that can also be really damaging. So I'm not going to say all farmers are terrible, because they're not, but certain farming practices can be really damaging to biodiversity. But it's a very good point, so thank you. Any other suggestions?
House building,
What was it?
development of housing.
Yes. So especially where you take land out of a natural, if you take an area semi-natural habitat and convert it, that results in a loss of that biodiversity. But also, if you don't develop things sensitively, you also end up with disconnects in terms of the web of biodiversity in an area. So it's really important that when you're developing things, that you think about the biodiversity and how to ensure that ecological connectivity is maintained. So yes, poor development also has an impact.
Zebra mussels.
Yes, invasive species are a big deal, and not just the animals, but also the plants as well. So there's quite an extensive list of quite damaging invasive species in Ireland, and they are my pet bugbear. I am mad for invasive species.
Japanese knotwood.
Yes, yes.
Rhododendrons.
It's really but yeah, I think we can have a look here now. So habitat loss, we've talked about that. Invasive species, we've talked about that. Fragmentation of habitat, that comes in under development. Declines in species, we've talked a little bit about, you know, the declines in freshwater pearl mussel, the declines in curlew. A lot of those things, they are threats to biodiversity, because the less species you have in a habitat, the easier it is for a big shock to knock the resilience out of that habitat. Whereas, you know, if you got a healthy species of animals in that area, then you're more resilient if there's sudden changes. And then the last thing is your environmental factors. So your water quality, whether you're in the sea, whether you're in a river, you know, it all impacts on biodiversity, and especially for things that are really sensitive, like your salmonids and your freshwater pearl mussels, you know, they need high quality water, they need good quality habitats, and so that's a big threat to biodiversity.
Aoife, Sarah said one as well, it's not on your list, it's a really good one: tourism and increased visitors. So you sort of muted about it before, the disturbance, especially people walking their dogs on mud flats, and the Brent geese that you had pictures of before. So that's I think another really good one there, Sarah.
Excellent. Yeah, it is a really good one, and it's one I meant to mention, especially for things like fixed dunes. So there's efforts being put in place, you know, for things like marm transplanting to stabilize dunes, because where you've got a lot of erosion of these dunes, you also get like the loss of the habitat that's there. And even some habitats are really sensitive to things like trampling. You know, it's like, with the best will in the world, if you don't realize that you're standing on like one of the only species of this plant, or one of the only individuals of this plant in that area, you might not realize the damage that does in terms of not just that plant itself, but also what could be quite a small population of that plant, both in the area and overall in the county and nationally. So it's definitely, it's a really good point, really well made.
Aoife, one really good point, if you don't mind me interrupting. I know that Michael's here from Inniscrone. They had a problem not with the local GAA, but with other GAAs from outside the county training in Inniscrone and running up and down the dunes. And it's a really good example of what a Tidy Towns group can do, because they did a lot of like face-to-face discussions with the local GA groups to explain to them why this wasn't really the best thing to be doing.
And also it can be really dangerous if your dunes are destabilized, you know, like it's super dangerous that you might end up with it subsiding, and God forbid it fall on people, like subside onto people as well. Like it can happen. So, you know, it's like ensuring that habitats are healthy isn't just healthy for biodiversity, but also it's safer for people to be around those habitats, that they're not, you know, suddenly going to subside on top of them. So yeah, like community outreach on and awareness of the threats is really important too. But if there's no other points, I might just hop on and I'm just going to highlight a few invasive species that are worth keeping an eye on. So the first one is rhododendron, and I just put it in here because you'll probably see it when it's in flower. It's got these kind of purple flowers, but it's worth being able to identify it when it, when it isn't in flower as well. So this is a rhododendron that I took a picture of in Union Wood. And while there's great efforts being done to remove it, it's also really important that when we notice it, that we report it. And so that's why I'm going to talk really quickly about reporting sightings of invasive species as well as everything else. Just so that, because if people don't know it's there, then it's very hard to get it removed. So it's worth knowing invasive species. So we already had this mentioned. So this is our Japanese knotweed, which is a menace. It's a menace, and it is really resilient, and it can regrow from fragments. So it's really important not to flail it, because if you flail it and cut it, then you end up with just loads of fragments that grow another plant. And it can grow from something like, even if you've got just 1 centimeter of I think it's the rhizome kind of root bit, but if you get like just even a small amount of it, it can regrow, and it's just really hard to get rid of. So it's really worth, if you see it, report it, but also if you have it, to make sure that you get it properly and professionally removed, because it can be seriously persistent and just be a huge nightmare. And then the other invasive species that I just want to talk about briefly is this one. So does anybody have any idea what this one is?
Giant hogweed.
Yes, excellent. God, we've got a bunch of botanists here. So this is giant hogweed.
Hogweed. Yeah.
Yeah, and I want to highlight this one because of the danger of kind of not knowing that it's there and then kind of getting kind of stuck into it. So giant hogweed, it can grow quite tall. I think it can grow up to like, oh gosh, can't remember exactly how high it grows, but you know, it can grow higher than a person.
That burns badly. Yeah.
And you'll see it has like purple spots on the stem, but also its sap is like, it's very important to avoid contact with its sap, because the sap can react with sunlight and cause really severe blistering. So if you do see it, make sure to steer clear, and make sure that kids know to avoid it as well, because the last thing you want is someone to go play hide and seek and run into a patch of hogweed. So I'm highlighting it mainly from a health and safety perspective as well as anything else. Like it's a really, really nasty plant. So I just wanted to highlight some everyday biodiversity that you find around the place, but I'm not sure if we have enough time, Sharon. I wanted to point out the tools as well, so I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, we're down to 5 minutes, although I'm sure you're happy to stay on, but there's a few questions as well, as I said.
Perfect. We'll skip over the everyday biodiversity, and I just want to briefly talk about connecting the dots. So,
and this is one of the questions that came up. Somebody wants to know about connecting the dots or making the lines.
Yeah. So in terms of where you have, if you're looking at your community and you're thinking, you know, I have a patch of woodland here and I have a pond here, and you know, thinking about how do I put in semi-natural habitats between those two, so that it's not just islands of habitat, but also a connected network of habitats as well. So maybe you have an area where it's like a grassland, like a park between an area of woodland and a pond. Maybe you want to put in a wildflower meadow, and that doesn't mean you have to reseed it. You know, you could just reduce your mowing and see what comes up. Or let's say you have an area where, I don't know, might be suitable for suitable for a hedgerow. Maybe you don't have space for a woodland, but you have space for a hedgerow. You know, that not only provides food for pollinators if you have a flowering hedgerow, but it also provides a corridor and an area of shelter. So let's say you have bees and bumblebees and pollinators, they can fly alongside the hedgerow because there's shelter, but there's also space for larger mammals to migrate through it and along it, so that they can move from one area of habitat to another. So those kind of linear habitats between areas of habitat can provide shelter and food, and they can kind of join the dots in terms of different types of habitats as well. So I hope that answers the question. And then briefly, I'm just going to go through, there's a few different, if you're interested in kind of learning a bit more and you just want to, you know, go out and do some casual recording, some identification apps that are really great are things like BirdNet, which helps you identify bird calls, which is probably the closest you're going to get to some birds. Nord University is great for IDing different types of birds. They'll give you pictures and then tell you characteristic traits about that bird. PlantNet, Seek, and iNaturalist are all helping you to identify different types of plants. And that is really great. As with all of them, you know, there's a certain amount of discretion that you need to take because, you know, like if it says it's edible, don't take its word for it. Never assume that whatever it says is exactly right. It's just more to give you an idea of maybe the type of family it's in and help you recognize characteristics. When you know a bit more and you want to record that stuff, especially things like, you know, invasive species, 2 places I'll send you is the National Biodiversity Data Centre has an app and they have a website where you can record the biodiversity that you see, including invasive species. And pollinators.ie has a portal where you can map your actions. So you can say, I've left this area grow wild for biodiversity. It's mowed twice a year. You can map that, and they are basically collecting a database of types of habitats that are being managed for biodiversity or for pollinators in Ireland, and it helps them to connect the dots, just like us. So yeah, that's kind of everything. I'll leave it on this slide just so that it doesn't go black on you, but if you have any questions, thanks very much for listening.
Thank you. You were just so enthusiastic and it was just really, really good. I have a couple of questions that came up in the chat. One I might open up to Philip as well, that Kira asked. You showed the picture before of one of the, I think it was the pyramidal orchid that came up, you said, just for when you didn't cut the grass in an area. So the question was whether or not they could be introduced, or what would you recommend?
I might leave that with Philip because I know orchids can be a bit picky in terms of like, they sometimes form associations with mycorrhizae, which are fungi in the soil. So some of them can be quite picky in terms of the habitats they live in.
Okay.
Yeah, the problem is where to get it from, because those kind of wild orchids, you never really see them for sale. So it's not just a case of buying them. And as Eva said, they're difficult to grow from seed. Well, it depends. They have this symbiotic relationship with fungi. So unless the particular fungus is present in the soil, the seeds won't germinate. So you could try, I suppose you could try collecting seeds and scattering them, but it won't do any harm. That's one of the things that if orchids have been growing in a certain area, if it's an established hay meadow for a long time, all the right fungi are there in the soil so that they'll grow easily. But if it's an area that has been cultivated for some other reason, and if they haven't been there a long time, these symbiotic fungi might no longer be there. But it's no harm to give it a try. But don't uproot them and transplant them anyway.
Okay. And another question from Kira that came up was just, and I think you answered it 2 weeks ago, Philip, was about if you're cutting a wildflower meadow, do you lift the cuttings or do you leave them? And I think I even know the answer to this one, but I'll let you answer that.
Well, it's better to take them away because otherwise they'll rot down and they'll provide more nutrition to the soil. So better to take them away.
Okay. Sarah was asking specifically with regard to tidy towns groups for ideas of how tidy towns groups can encourage and enthuse the community about the wildlife in their area. So just on the raising awareness, I'm just sharing a little thing on chat. Lots and lots of things that community tidy towns groups do. So maybe on social media, share the first sightings of the first swallows or the first brent geese or the first salmon jumping. You could do photo competitions, have a fact of the month. There's one that I love. You talked about gannets before. I mean, the fact that gannets have got air sacs in their heads. So when they hit the water at 60 miles an hour, their heads don't implode. So things like that. Let's, sharing juicy facts to children. Or to indeed adults. Another one there.
Here's a fact about the strawberry tree. We were talking about whether it was edible. I did eat them one time and they were quite edible, but not very tasty. But the important fact is in Portugal, they use it for making brandy. And apparently when it's distilled, it's very good.
There's a theme. There's a theme here coming out. And I've just posted it as well. You have your food calendar of elderberry champagne, or your wild garlic pesto, or your slow gin, or your you've got Prati Pranigan who does her seaweed scavenging and has got lots of books on seaweed, edible seaweed. Other things that are nice that I've seen in a Tidy Towns point of view is where if maybe at an entrance to a woods or a walk, they've got laminated sheets for a child version and an adult version of things that people should look for when they're walking around that woods. So just, you know, something that people can hold in their hand, maybe not good in COVID times, but it was something that people used to be able to look at. You could maybe develop one that you put on an app, for example, as well. I'm just sharing all of this on the app. As Aoife mentioned, all the citizen science projects in Biodiversity Ireland. There's a hedgehog survey going on at the moment. There's ladybird surveys. So it's reporting those things. People love interactive activities. So when life returns to normal, you could have guided dawn course walks are always really popular. Bat walks are really popular. Maybe something more COVID friendly would be having trip cameras that you share pictures of wildlife animals. We've got some beautiful footage of badgers playing outside a really large set in Sligo, and we've popped it onto our Facebook page about a couple of months ago and our website. And then getting back to that question about linking areas, again, just to think of all the things that you can do to enhance the habitats. So native planting, linking your habitats, get the public out planting a short distance of native trees. The don't mow, let it grow, let your dandelions grow. And I know when we didn't grow our lawn in the front garden, we got cowslips came up in the front garden as well. So just rattling those ideas up too. I'm talking a lot. Any other questions? Just trying to squeeze everything in there.
I think just another thing from like the getting people involved is like it's really great when you do like collaborations with other groups, because I know when I was in Scouts back in Kilkenny, like we did some collaborations with the Tidy Towns groups, and some of them were just like, you know, local cleanups along the river, but some of them, like, you know, Scout groups are great for going out into nature, but sometimes having like a little nature talk before you go out is really good, because then you go out and you actually realize some of the stuff that's right around you, like sundews. I didn't know that sundews and carnivorous plants. I thought carnivorous plants were something you found in the rainforest, not something you found in the bogs of Connemara. So yeah, sometimes just that kind of cross group collaboration is really good for getting people to see different things and learn different stuff.
Aoife, thanks again. There's a lot of thank yous coming up in the chat. We're going to have to finish up now, really, unless if there's any other burning questions, either shout now. Next week, we were due to discuss completing your Tidy Towns entry form. It hasn't been published yet, this year's entry form. So what I might do, we can still talk through the topics and what the options, or I might swap around for the following weeks, depending on whether or not you're happy with that. I think it'd be nice to actually have the entry form that we can look at it and discuss it when it's published. It might be out by next week. I'm just not sure at the moment. The next topic, apart from completing your entry form, was due to be planning and working with your community and involving different community groups. So very much as we were talking this evening. And don't forget, the last session is meant to be all about your ideas of what you want to find more of. So if you want to hear Aoife again, we can pull in Emmeline to talk specifically about pollinators. We can talk about waste. We can talk about built heritage. Anything else that people want to do, let us know. Okay.
Great, Sharon, thanks. And I think, sorry, just one other thing that I think I just mentioned to you earlier that's come up from a few groups is just that aspect of, you know, so much great individual work going on in the Tidy Towns, but maybe there's a need for more support at a county level for the network of Tidy Towns to be able to share ideas more, to be able to bulk buy, you know, all those kind of different things that might come from a from a more supported network. So just any ideas people have around that we can kind of pursue or take into the local authority to kind of highlight what the work that they're doing and why there's a need for perhaps more support for the network in Sligo.
Well done. Thank you, Sarah. Good idea. So let Sarah and Emer know in the PPN if you want any specific, or just come back to us. We're here to help you and hold your hand through this, and keep feeding you lots of ideas and an answer to your queries. So if we can help in any other way, that'd be great. Thank you all very, very much. Aoife, that was brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening.
Okay, so one of the questions was, sorry, I know a lot of people are leaving anyway, could we come to tidy town areas? We could maybe do that, and you know, we could look at that for a brief area as well, but in the interim, send photographs in. That's the other thing we can help with. I'll talk to Sarah about that after this.
Yeah.
Thank you.